The chandeliers of Harthwell House burned like captive constellations, their crystal throats dripping light upon silk and satin, upon powdered shoulders and gloved hands that fluttered with the nervous delight of London's most watchful society. Beneath that golden blaze stood Lady Eliza Ashbourne, as composed as porcelain and twice as easily fractured. She had been invited, though not warmly, tolerated, though not embraced. Her family name still carried the faint bruise of scandal, a whisper that clung to her skirts more stubbornly than perfume. She felt the stares before she heard them, the way one senses a draft before the flame flickers. Eliza did not flinch. She had learned, in the quiet humiliations of recent seasons, that dignity was not bestowed but chosen. Her gown was of pale blue silk, unadorned save for her mother's modest pearls, and her dark hair was arranged with deliberate simplicity. Where other young ladies sparkled, she shone only with restraint. It was a dangerous sort of beauty, one that did not beg to be admired but dared to be understood. Across the ballroom, the orchestra faltered for the briefest breath before resuming its waltz. The Duke of Ravenshire had arrived. Alexander Ravenshire did not so much enter a room as claim it. Tall, severe, his black coat cut with military precision, he moved through the crowd like a blade through silk. A scar traced faintly along his temple, lending his handsomeness a harder edge, as though life had carved him for endurance rather than pleasure. Conversations thinned in his wake. Mothers angled daughters toward him with subtle desperation. He acknowledged no one with more than the smallest inclination of his head. His gaze found Eliza almost at once. It was not the first time he had looked upon her, yet tonight his attention bore weight. There was calculation in it and something colder, an old grievance polished to a shine. For it was Eliza's brother whose recklessness had ruined the Duke's sister 2 years prior, dragging her name through pamphlets and gossip sheets until she fled England in disgrace. Though the courts had proved nothing, society required no proof, only appetite. Ravenshire's sister had paid with exile. He had paid with silence. Now he crossed the marble floor toward the Ashbourne girl. "Eliza," murmured a companion at her side. "He comes for you." She inclined her head as though accepting a summons she had long expected. When he bowed before her, it was executed with impeccable courtesy, yet devoid of warmth. "Lady Eliza," he said, his voice low and even, "may I claim the next dance?" The request rippled outward. She felt the circle tightening, expectation crackling like static. Refusal would be folly, acceptance, surrender. She rose. "You may, Your Grace." His gloved hand enclosed hers. It was firm, cool, entirely controlled. As they joined the turning couples, the orchestra swelled, and the room resumed its theater of elegance. Yet the air between them was taut as drawn wire. "You honor me," she said, her tone polite. "Honor has little to do with this," he replied. She did not ask what did. She sensed the blade beneath his civility. They moved with flawless precision, neither stumbling nor colliding, their bodies aligned in a choreography older than either of them. Around them whispers gathered. Eliza felt them like needles at her back. "I am told," the Duke continued, "that you value candor." "I value truth," she answered, "though I find it seldom welcome." "Then you will appreciate mine." His gaze did not waver. "I intend to marry you." Her step faltered only once before she recovered the rhythm. Gasps traveled outward in widening circles. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "such declarations are not made in passing." "I do not speak in passing." His jaw tightened. "This marriage will serve a purpose. It will correct an imbalance." Understanding bloomed, cold and inevitable. "You seek reparation." "I seek justice. For an injury I did not commit. Your name is bound to the offender. And so you bind me in turn." The music swelled, oblivious. Her pulse beat steady despite the heat rising beneath her skin. "Refuse me," he said quietly, "and your family's position will erode further. Accept, and it shall be restored. Consider it equitable." Equitable. The word struck like a gavel. "You would make me your duchess as punishment," she murmured. "As reminder," he corrected. They turned once more beneath the blaze of crystal light. She saw now what lay beneath his composure, not cruelty for sport but grief hardened into resolve. His sister's laughter had once rung through these same halls. Now it echoed only in memory. "You mistake me, Your Grace," Eliza said, lifting her chin. "I am not so fragile that I must be wielded." "No," he replied, something flickering in his eyes. "You are precisely strong enough." The final notes trembled into silence. He released her, then did the unthinkable. Before the assembled elite, before mothers and rivals and the merciless chroniclers of fashion and fault, He drew from his pocket a ring, an austere band crowned with a solitary diamond. "Lady Eliza Ashbourne," he said, his voice carrying with effortless authority, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The room inhaled. She felt humiliation coil at her feet like smoke. He had given her no private courtesy, no shield from spectacle. This was strategy laid bare. Yet within that exposure lay a choice, and within that choice power. If she refused, her family would descend further into ruin. If she accepted, she would walk willingly into a union forged of vengeance. She saw in his expression an expectation of compliance born of calculation. He believed her cornered. Eliza extended her hand. "I accept, your grace." The words fell with the clarity of struck glass. A murmur surged through the ballroom, astonishment mingled with something like admiration. He slid the ring upon her finger. For an instant, their skin touched unmediated by silk or lace. It was the smallest contact. Yet in that fleeting warmth, something unanticipated stirred. Not forgiveness, not affection, but recognition. He had expected pliancy or despair. Instead he found composure. "You surprise me," he said softly so only she could hear. "Then we are already unevenly matched," she replied. Applause broke out, thin and obligatory. The Duke offered his arm and she took it, the embodiment of serene obedience. Yet as they walked through the parted crowd, Eliza felt the first tremor of defiance root itself within her chest. This marriage might begin as his revenge, but she would not be its victim. Rain traced thin, restless fingers down the carriage windows as the newly betrothed couple departed London beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Within the velvet-lined interior, silence settled like a third passenger. Lady Eliza, now promised to a dukedom, sat opposite Alexander Ravenshire, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the diamond upon her finger catching the intermittent flash of passing lantern light. The ring gleamed not as a symbol of romance, but as a seal impressed upon wax, final, deliberate, irrevocable. The Duke watched the rain rather than her. His profile was composed of angles and restraint, the faint scar at his temple more pronounced in the dimness. He had offered her no words of reassurance since the ballroom. He had not attempted apology. Revenge, once declared, required no embellishment. "You need not escort me to the estate yourself, your grace," she said at last, her tone even. "A wife secured requires no further supervision." His gaze shifted toward her, sharp as flint. "You mistake me, Lady Eliza. I escort you because the world must see that you travel under my protection." "Protection?" she echoed softly. "From whom?" "From those who believe you ensnared me." The words stung less than she expected. "And do you correct them?" He did not answer. The rhythm of hooves against wet stone filled the space between them, a steady percussion of inevitability. Ravenshire estate rose from the mist at dusk, vast and severe, its towers cutting through the low clouds like silent accusations. Eliza regarded her future home without awe. Grandeur had never impressed her, it merely magnified isolation. As the carriage rolled to a halt, servants lined the entrance in symmetrical rows, their bows precise, their expressions carefully unreadable. She descended first. The wind caught her cloak, pressing the silk of her gown against her frame. She felt their scrutiny, not open disdain but appraisal. Was this the woman who had secured the Duke? Was this the Ashbourne daughter whose brother's indiscretion had once darkened this household? Alexander joined her at the steps. "Remember," he murmured without looking at her, "you are Duchess here. Conduct yourself accordingly." "I have conducted myself accordingly for years," she replied. "It is others who misinterpret composure as ambition." His jaw tightened, though whether at her boldness or her clarity she could not tell. The first days passed in ceremonial adjustment. A swift, unadorned wedding followed within the estate chapel, attended, whispered about, scrutinized. No music softened the vows. No lingering touch adorned the exchange. When he placed the ring upon her finger before the altar, his voice did not tremble. Yet when she repeated the vow to honor him, a flicker, brief and unguarded, crossed his eyes as though he had not expected her to speak it with conviction. That evening, a formal dinner gathered the neighboring aristocracy. Candles burned tall upon silver candelabra, their flames bending in subtle draughts. Eliza sat at the Duke's right hand, her posture impeccable, her face composed. Conversation flowed like perfumed wine until Lady Penhist, draped in emerald satin and malice, set down her glass with pointed delicacy. "One cannot help but admire ambition," Lady Penhist remarked, her smile thin. "To ascend so swiftly, from uncertainty to Duchess." The table quieted. Eliza lifted her gaze. Fortune rarely asks permission, my lady. It simply arrives. A faint murmur of approval stirred from one end of the table. Alexander's hand stilled upon his knife. Lady Penhest tilted her head. And yet some fortunes are engineered. Before Eliza could respond, the Duke's voice cut cleanly through the tension. You tread close to discourtesy, Lady Penhest. The woman's brows arched. I speak only what society wonders. Then allow society to wonder in silence. His eyes hardened. You may question my judgment, but you shall not question my Duchess. The words fell with unmistakable authority. Heat crept into Eliza's cheeks, not from humiliation but from something dangerously akin to gratitude. He had defended her publicly. Whether from pride or principle, she could not yet discern. But the shift was undeniable. She was no longer merely his instrument, she was under his shield. The evening resumed, though the undercurrent remained altered. Whispers softened. Glances recalibrated. Later, alone in the long corridor outside her chamber, Eliza paused before a small table where a parcel lay awaiting her. It was bound in dark ribbon, unmarked save for her name in a hand she recognized instantly, precise, disciplined, unmistakably his. Inside rested a slender volume of poetry, leather-bound, its edges gilded. She turned the first page. A line had been underlined in faint graphite. Even in winter, the heart remembers the shape of spring. Her breath caught. There was no accompanying note. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Alexander stepped into the candlelight. You received something, he observed. A book, she said, holding it gently. It appears I have an anonymous admirer. His expression remained impassive. Books circulate freely in large houses. And handwriting? She asked quietly. Pause. I am not in the habit of annotating gifts, he replied. She studied him, sensing the careful denial. Then I must thank the air for its thoughtfulness. He inclined his head slightly, as though conceding nothing while acknowledging everything. You defended me tonight, she said. I defended my title. And I am part of that title? You are part of this house. The distinction lingered. A distant clock chimed the late hour. The estate settled into nocturnal stillness. Good evening, Your Grace, she said, turning toward her chamber. Eliza. Her name upon his lips halted her. Yes. He seemed to search for words and then, as if reconsidering their cost, simply added, Rest well. It was a small civility, yet it resonated more deeply than ornamented flattery ever could. Inside her chamber, she set the poetry upon her bedside table and removed her gloves slowly, thoughtfully. The memory of his defense, the unexpected gift, the faint tremor beneath his restraint, all coiled within her thoughts. This marriage had been forged in vengeance. That truth had not altered. But something had shifted. He had drawn a line against the world on her behalf. And for the first time since the ballroom, she wondered whether the Duke of Ravenshire feared not her family's past, but the quiet possibility that his carefully constructed revenge was beginning to fracture. Winter arrived without ceremony, laying a pale hush over Ravenshire estate and sealing its vast lawns beneath frost that glittered like crushed diamonds. The fountains stood silent, their basins rimmed with ice, and the long corridors within the house carried a deeper stillness, as though the very walls were listening. Eliza felt the change not merely in the air but in the rhythm of the household. The Duke rode longer hours. Letters arrived more frequently. Invitations were declined with increasing brevity. Something restless had awakened beneath his composure. The charity assembly in the village had been her suggestion, modest in scale but earnest in purpose. She had insisted upon attending despite the bitter wind, determined that the title she bore should not exist in ornamental isolation. Alexander had neither forbidden nor encouraged her. He had merely said, "Do not overexert yourself," in a tone that implied command disguised as courtesy. She returned flushed and trembling. By nightfall the tremor had deepened into fever. The physician came and went with grave assurances, prescribing rest and warmth. Servants moved softly through her chamber, replenishing coals, steeping herbs. Yet it was the Duke who remained after the last door had closed. Eliza drifted between waking and haze, aware only of the firelight flickering against the canopy above her bed and the steady presence seated beside it. She had expected distance. Instead, she felt the faint pressure of a cool cloth against her brow, replaced at careful intervals. "You need not keep vigil, Your Grace," she murmured at one point, her voice unsteady. "I have dismissed Parliament engagements for lesser inconveniences," he replied. "You are not an inconvenience." She attempted a faint smile. "No, merely your reminder." Silence answered her. When next she opened her eyes, the fire had burned lower. Snow whispered against the window panes. Alexander sat forward now, elbows upon his knees, hands clasped as though in restrained prayer. "If I am merely your revenge," she said, the fever loosening the guard she so carefully maintained, "I pray I have at least been an honorable one." His head lifted sharply. "You were never meant to matter," he said, the words emerging as though drawn against resistance. The admission did not wound her, it clarified. "Yet I do," she replied, her gaze steady despite the weakness in her limbs. He rose and crossed to the window as if distance might restore his equilibrium. "Your brother destroyed my sister's life," he said, each syllable deliberate. "He promised marriage, then allowed gossip to devour her when alliances shifted. She bore humiliation that was not hers alone. I could not challenge him without reopening scandal. So I chose another means. To marry his sister," Eliza finished softly. "To ensure he would watch you inhabit the house he once sought to court. The cruelty was not theatrical, it was strategic." She absorbed it without flinching. "I did not know," she said after a moment, "of promises or betrayal. My brother confided only in mirrors." "Convenient ignorance does not absolve blood," he answered, though the force of the statement seemed diminished. She drew a slow breath. "Then allow me to offer truth in place of ignorance. When your sister fled, debts followed her. Quiet ones. I paid them." He turned. "You presume much. I presume nothing. I acted." Her fingers tightened against the coverlet. "Anonymously. Through intermediaries. I believed it kinder that she never know from whom the relief came." He crossed the room in 3 strides. "Why?" "Because she did not deserve to carry her brother's shame any more than I deserve to carry mine." The fire snapped between them. "You expect gratitude?" he asked, though his voice lacked its former steel. "I expect nothing. Least of all absolution." He studied her as though seeing not a symbol of grievance but a woman defined by choices he had not accounted for. The careful architecture of his resentment shifted, unsettled by a foundation he had overlooked. "You paid from your own dowry," he said quietly. "Yes. And you never spoke of it. Mercy loses its worth when paraded." The word struck him harder than accusation could have. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the glass. Within, something unspoken fractured. He reached for her hand, not by accident this time, not brushed in passing, but deliberately, enclosing her fingers within his palm. "They told me you were meek," he said almost to himself. "They often mistake restraint for weakness." He exhaled, a sound closer to surrender than frustration. "You should have despised me." "Perhaps I did," she answered. "But I have learned that bitterness is a chain that fastens more securely to the one who wears it." A flicker of something unfamiliar crossed his expression. Regret, perhaps, or the first reluctant respect. "I built this marriage upon injury," he said. "It seemed righteous. And now?" He did not answer immediately. His thumb traced an unconscious arc against her knuckles, as though mapping unfamiliar territory. "Now it seems incomplete." Her pulse quickened despite the fever's ebb. "Incomplete how?" "As though I misjudged the measure of you." A fragile stillness gathered. The distance that had defined them since the ballroom thinned, replaced not by passion but by recognition, 2 wounded prides acknowledging shared endurance. The clock in the corridor chimed the late hour. "You should rest," he said at last, though he did not release her hand. "And you?" she asked. "I will remain." "For revenge?" she murmured faintly. "For clarity." The word lingered. Her eyes drifted closed, yet she did not withdraw her hand. The fire burned lower, shadows deepening along the carved bedposts. Alexander remained seated beside her, the cold geometry of his resolve softening under the weight of revelation. He had married her to wound another. Yet the wound had altered direction. As dawn's first pale light filtered through frost-laced panes, he realized with unsettling certainty that the true imbalance no longer lay between families, but within himself. And for the first time since he had placed the ring upon her finger beneath glittering chandeliers, the Duke of Ravenshire feared that revenge was no longer the strongest force binding him to his wife. Spring did not arrive at Ravenshire with exuberance but with caution, as though the earth itself hesitated to trust renewal. Frost receded from the lawns and silver veils, revealing tender shoots beneath. The rose arbor along the southern terrace stirred with fragile green, and sunlight filtered through thinning clouds in hesitant warmth. Eliza walked there often now, her strength restored, though her thoughts remained unsettled. Illness had altered more than her pulse. It had shifted the balance between herself and her husband in ways neither had yet named. Alexander watched her from the library window on more than one occasion, a habit he neither justified nor denied. The sight of her moving among the early blossoms, her hand brushing petals with absent reverence, disturbed him with its quiet intimacy. She no longer seemed an emblem of his grievance. She seemed instead the keeper of something gentler he had nearly extinguished. It was in this tentative season that the past returned with sharpened teeth. The announcement arrived by way of a calling card presented without apology. Mr. Jonathan Ashbourne sought audience. Eliza's brother had not written in months. He had not sought reconciliation, nor offered regret. His sudden presence upon the estate steps carried the scent of desperation rather than affection. Alexander received him in the study, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and the steady scent of polished oak. Eliza stood near the hearth, composed though pale. Jonathan entered with the careless charm that had once secured him invitations to every drawing-room in London. Time had thinned that charm into something brittle. "Your Grace," he said with a shallow bow. "Sister." "You have chosen an inconvenient hour," Alexander replied, not offering a seat. Jonathan's smile faltered. "I come in confidence." "You forfeited confidence long ago," Eliza said quietly. Her brother's gaze flicked toward her, irritation masked poorly by civility. "I require assistance. Financial assistance." Alexander's expression did not change. "State your terms plainly." Jonathan drew a folded document from his coat. "There are letters, misinterpreted of course, that may resurface. They could revive certain misunderstandings regarding your sister, Your Grace. Unless resolved." The room stilled. "You would barter disgrace?" Alexander asked, his voice calm in a way that suggested danger. "I would prevent inconvenience," Jonathan countered smoothly, "at a cost far less than scandal." Eliza stepped forward. "You swore those rumors were false." "They are exaggerated," he replied. "Society requires narrative. I simply offer discretion." Alexander crossed the space between them with measured steps. "You mistake my silence for vulnerability. I tolerated your past cowardice because exposure would have harmed my sister further. But do not presume I fear truth." Jonathan's composure fractured. "And do you fear your wife's name entangled again in public whisper?" The implication hung heavy. Eliza felt the old humiliation rise like heat beneath her collar, yet she did not retreat. "If my name must endure scrutiny," she said, "it will endure it honestly." Alexander turned toward her, surprise and admiration mingling in his gaze. The choice before him was clear: yield to coercion to preserve her dignity, or confront scandal to reclaim justice. Revenge had once guided him with ruthless simplicity. Now the equation had altered. "You will not extort this house," he said to Jonathan. "Leave. Immediately." Jonathan's eyes hardened. "Then you invite spectacle." Alexander's voice lowered, each word deliberate. "If spectacle comes, it will not destroy her." Silence fell like a drawn curtain. Jonathan departed with a sharp bow, the door closing behind him with decisive finality. For several moments neither husband nor wife spoke. The ticking of the mantel clock measured the space between them. "You should not have risked it," Eliza said at last. "If those letters exist." "Then they shall be answered," Alexander interrupted. "Not purchased." She studied him carefully. "You would jeopardize your sister's restored peace?" "I would not jeopardize my wife's honor to preserve the illusion of control." The words resonated more deeply than he perhaps intended. They were not spoken in fury but in conviction. Eliza's composure wavered. "You once vowed to make me a reminder." "I was mistaken." The admission came without embellishment. "Mistaken in marrying me?" she asked. "In believing vengeance sufficient," he replied. A breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of thawing earth. The season's quiet transformation seemed to echo within the room. "If scandal rises," she said softly, "I will face it beside you." He regarded her with an intensity that dissolved pretense. "You owe me no loyalty beyond duty." "Nor you me," she answered. "Yet we stand here." Something unguarded passed between them, an acknowledgement forged not of obligation but choice. Alexander extended his hand. Not ceremonially, not in command, simply open. She placed hers within it. The contact no longer startled, it steadied. "I will investigate these threats," he said. "And I will clear my sister's name without surrendering yours." "And if that proves impossible?" His gaze did not waver. "Then I will choose you." The declaration settled into the quiet room with startling weight. Eliza felt the fragile architecture of their marriage shift again, no longer braced solely by pride or retaliation but by something more perilous: devotion in its infancy. Outside, the first rose of spring unfurled against the terrace wall, pale and tentative. Inside, the Duke of Ravenshire understood with unsettling clarity that he had crossed a threshold from which retreat would require cruelty he no longer possessed. And as he held his wife's hand, not in ownership but in allegiance, he realized that the true battle ahead would not be fought in parliament or pamphlets, but within the choice he had just spoken aloud. The great hall of Ravenshire estate was alive with muted tension, though outwardly it gleamed with polished splendor. Candles glimmered in brass sconces, casting dancing shadows along the walnut panels. Aristocracy had gathered, drawn by the rumor of revelation, each guest an eager witness to the unmasking of scandal. The long oak table had been cleared for the evening's proceedings, but the weight of expectation filled the space more densely than the finest silver and crystal. Eliza stood near the hearth, composed yet alert, her gown of soft cream silk trailing lightly across the polished floor. Her hair was swept into a simple chignon, yet a few deliberate tendrils escaped, softening the severe lines of her jaw. She bore the calm of one who had endured, and yet beneath it glimmered a quiet apprehension. Alexander Ravenshire stood opposite her, his posture rigid with command, his black coat tailored to perfection, cravat starched. The scar upon his temple caught the candlelight, a subtle reminder of past battles, both public and private. His gaze, however, did not wander the room. It was fixed, singular, upon Eliza. There had been no public union built on affection, yet tonight, he realized that the foundation of respect, tempered by understanding, might be far stronger than mere sentiment. A hush fell as her brother, Jonathan Ashbourne, was escorted into the hall. His polished exterior betrayed nothing of the guilt he carried, yet his hands twitched slightly, betraying the anxiety he hoped to conceal. He produced a folded collection of letters and documents, evidence he intended to manipulate circumstance and revive whispers of disgrace. The Duke's lips pressed into a thin line. Every motion had been calculated, yet now the room's atmosphere bristled with potential chaos. "Your Grace," Jonathan began, his voice smooth but brittle, "these letters, once public, could unravel much, or be negotiated." Alexander's expression remained impervious. "We will not negotiate on the currency of dishonor," he said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of inevitability. "Leave these here or leave entirely." His tone was that of a man who had weighed justice against pride and chosen both in favor of the one who deserved protection. His hand, gloved yet unyielding, rested briefly upon the stack of papers, a subtle assertion of authority. Eliza stepped closer to him. Her voice was soft but unshakable. "You cannot allow him to dictate our lives, Alexander. Let the truth prevail. Whatever disgrace he wishes to impose, it will be met with honesty." A faint tension shifted in the room, the aristocrats leaning slightly forward, ears trained, curiosity piqued. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and melting candle, of polished oak and the subtle hint of roses from the terrace. Time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. Jonathan's lips tightened. "And if the society refuses to believe truth over rumor?" he asked. "If your reputation cannot withstand exposure?" Alexander's eyes, dark and unwavering, met Eliza's. The flicker of candlelight illuminated something unspoken. A covenant, a promise, a shared defiance. "Then we endure together," he said. "You will not stand alone. And I will not falter." Eliza's pulse quickened. The Duke's words carried no artifice. This was a commitment forged not of ceremony or society, but of recognition. He had once married her to punish her family. Now he declared that he would shield her from the same forces that had once destroyed his own sister. The letters were returned to Jonathan with a swift, decisive motion. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but Alexander's presence forbade it. The room's whispers faltered, replaced by an uneasy silence that carried more authority than any worded reprimand. Jonathan departed, leaving the heavy oak doors to swing closed behind him with a sound that reverberated through the hall like judgment. Eliza turned to Alexander, her composure unwavering, though her cheeks bore a trace of warmth. "You have done more than I expected," she murmured, her fingers brushing a stray lock of hair. "I had thought this day would bring only humiliation." He inclined his head, the faintest shadow of a smile breaking through his normally impassive mask. "I have learned," he said, "that revenge is hollow when it leaves the heart unguarded." His voice softened, though the gravity remained. "And that protecting what is dear often requires courage greater than any public battle." The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the subtle tension of muscle and the quiet intensity in his eyes. For the first time, Eliza saw beyond the austerity, glimpsing the man who had suffered, who had calculated, and who now chose compassion over calculation. The air between them vibrated, not with scandal or expectation, but with understanding, a delicate, nascent intimacy that neither dared name aloud. The guests, sensing that the confrontation had concluded, began to murmur softly amongst themselves, yet the couple remained oblivious to the minutiae of society. For a fleeting moment, the grandeur of the hall, the scent of wax and roses, and the glimmer of candlelight seemed to cocoon them from the world beyond. Alexander extended a hand to Eliza, not as a command, not as a token, but in deliberate invitation. Her own hand, small and steady, met his. The contact was not electric in the way of passion but resonant with trust, the first unspoken acknowledgement that their bond had evolved beyond obligation and into something far more fragile, far more perilous. In that simple touch lay a quiet declaration. Their marriage, born of vengeance, had transformed into an alliance of hearts. She regarded him, her gaze soft but unwavering. "You have spared me from humiliation, yet you have also changed it," she said. "I had expected only coldness, yet I find your presence protective." "And I," he replied, his voice low, "expected merely to punish, yet I find you indispensable." The words lingered, unadorned and true. Attention, previously taut with restraint and expectation, began to relax, replaced by an intimacy that carried its own gravity. They did not speak further, allowing the firelight and silence to speak volumes. A gentle breeze lifted from the terrace, wafting in the subtle scent of early blooms, a promise of seasons yet to come. The mansion, vast and imposing, seemed to shrink around them, yielding space for something quieter, more human. The Duke's hand remained upon hers, not in dominion but in allegiance, a pledge against the world outside the walls. Eliza's gaze fell to the marble hearth, where the embers glowed with a slow persistence. She considered the months past, the public humiliation, the calculated distance, the subtle gestures that had revealed a man at once severe and capable of unexpected tenderness. She realized that the measures of respect, loyalty, and devotion had grown in tandem with the frost-thawed gardens outside. The house, once a stage of social theater, had become a crucible in which they had been tested and transformed. Outside, the night deepened. Snow had begun again, fine as sifted flour, muting the gardens, blanketing the terraces, cloaking the estate in quiet contemplation. Inside, the couple stood together, hands entwined, facing a future uncharted yet less fearsome than before. The promise of revelation, of confrontation, had passed, yet the undercurrent of society's gaze remained, an ever-present reminder of the delicate equilibrium upon which they now stood. He brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that spoke of familiarity and care, neither extravagant nor presumptuous. She allowed it, a tacit acknowledgement of the trust that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. No words could fully encapsulate the delicate architecture of their union. No ceremony could define what had emerged in these weeks of challenge and quiet confrontation. It was an intimacy rooted in endurance, observation, and shared purpose. "You have changed my understanding of this house," she said softly. "And you," he replied, "have changed my understanding of myself." The words hung between them, delicate as frost on window panes, yet resonant with permanence. The grandeur of Ravenshire, the machinations of society, the weight of legacy, all had been tested against the simplest measure, the choice to stand beside one another in truth. A carriage rolled past the outer gates, breaking the quiet with the soft rattle of wheels on cobblestone. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, its resonance a reminder that the world continued beyond these walls. Yet in this room, the past grievances, the potential for scandal, and the carefully plotted revenge had converged into a singular, enduring resolution, alliance born of shared conviction. Alexander's hand, still holding hers, tightened just slightly, a silent affirmation. Eliza's gaze lifted, meeting his, and in that meeting lay recognition, unspoken, undeniable, irrevocable. The house seemed to exhale with them, the candles flickered in concert, and the fire's glow expanded to fill the spaces where doubt had lingered. As they stepped back from the hearth, ready to leave the hall and its expectant eyes, the first faint light of dawn touched the eastern windows, promising a new day. The air, scented with lingering candle smoke and the faint perfume of roses, carried the quiet weight of decisions made and futures secured. The Duke of Ravenshire, once bound by vengeance, now understood that the greatest conquest lay not in strategy or retaliation but in choosing the woman beside him above all else. And as they passed through the corridors, hands still joined, a faint whisper of movement from the terrace drew their attention. A solitary figure watching the estate, carrying intentions neither known nor anticipated, reminding them that the balance of power, within and beyond these walls, had yet to be fully tested. The morning broke over Ravenshire estate in pale gold and mist, a fragile light spilling across the terraces and glimmering against frost-softened blooms. Lady Eliza Ashbourne stood at the balcony, the fabric of her gown rustling faintly in the gentle wind. Her hands rested lightly upon the stone balustrade, fingers brushing its cold, carved edges as though seeking some steadiness beyond herself. The weeks since the confrontation with her brother had shifted everything within her. The certainty of her position, the unspoken tension with Alexander, and the fragile hope that had begun to root in their shared silences. Outside, the gardens stretched in ordered perfection. Yet even in this display of meticulous control, nature reminded them that life could not be entirely tamed. Alexander entered quietly, his presence near the doorway like a shadow falling over the morning. He did not announce himself, and she did not turn immediately. He moved with the deliberate precision she had come to recognize, each step measured, each gesture controlled, yet somehow softened by the intimacy of shared time. For months he had stood by her, a silent sentinel. Tonight he would act with purpose. "Eliza," he said, voice low and rich, threading through the air like velvet. She turned, meeting his gaze, the color of storm-darkened skies flecked with sunlight, and for the first time she felt the weight of his thought pressing upon her without reproach. "We face the culmination of all that has passed. The choice we make now cannot be undone." She inhaled, the chill of early morning mingling with anticipation. "I have stood by your judgment," she said, measured, "and you by mine. We are not strangers to consequence." "No," he admitted, stepping closer, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. "Yet some consequences require more than observation, they require confrontation." Her brow arched slightly, lips parted. He did not elaborate, but the weight of the statement, as always, carried its own clarity. The carriage that had conveyed her brother Jonathan to London weeks prior now returned, accompanied by an escort of legal attendants and society witnesses. It bore letters, documents, and the faintly embroidered threats of revived scandal, a final gambit intended to fracture the fragile equilibrium Alexander had so painstakingly established. Jonathan had returned under the guise of reconciliation, yet Eliza knew better. The measure of her brother's ambition had never been tempered by decency. Alexander's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "We will meet him as equals," he said. "Not as adversaries but as a united front. He cannot fracture what has already been forged in truth." She nodded, the words grounding her, yet the tension between them tightened her chest. For the first time she realized that courage was not merely endurance, it was deliberate action in the face of fear. The estate's great hall had been prepared, the polished floors reflecting the morning light, candles lit though the day had begun, their flames symbolic of vigilance rather than ceremony. Society would be present, as was customary for such revelations, though their eyes mattered little beside the clarity that burned between husband and wife. The door opened, and Jonathan entered, bowing superficially, though his eyes flickered with barely concealed calculation. "Alexander, Eliza," he began, his voice smooth, "I trust you have considered the implications of my letters. Society may require clarity, and I offer it." Alexander's hand did not move from Eliza's shoulder, a subtle anchor. "We require nothing but the truth," he said. "And that will be given on our terms or not at all." Jonathan's gaze flicked toward Eliza, expecting a tremor, a hesitation, any sign of weakness. Instead he found composure tempered with quiet defiance. "You have grown stronger than I anticipated," he said. Eliza's lips curved faintly. "And you have remained the same," she countered. The exchange drew a subtle ripple through the room. Whispers carried on the faintly scented air of beeswax and polished oak. Outside, the gardens, visible through tall windows, bore witness to this confrontation, the first pale blooms of spring nodding in silent encouragement. Alexander moved forward, producing the letters from Jonathan's grip with deliberate calm. He scanned the contents quickly, the analytical mind she had come to respect working with precision honed by years of scrutiny. "These letters," he said, voice carrying across the quiet hall, "do not contain truth. They contain speculation, insinuation, and nothing more. No harm can follow when the facts are laid bare." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You underestimate the appetite of society." Even falsehood, once published, finds believers. Alexander's gaze hardened. Then we shall provide certainty. And we shall do so together. The letters were handed back, discarded onto the nearest table, their potential for mischief nullified by the weight of authority and intention. Jonathan's eyes met Eliza's, searching for any crack in the composure he had hoped to exploit. Finding none, he turned sharply, departing with the curt politeness of a man who recognized defeat, yet refused to display humility. Eliza exhaled, the first true relaxation in days settling through her chest. She turned to Alexander, noting the faint tension in his shoulders, the subtle relief in his expression, and the softening of his eyes. The seasons of confrontation, the careful negotiations of dignity, and the vigilant protection he had afforded her all coalesced into this moment of clarity. "You have done more than I expected," she said softly, her hand brushing against his as she stepped closer. "No more than you deserve," he replied, the cadence of his voice steady, commanding, yet unexpectedly tender. "The past was forged in vengeance. The present belongs to us." The moment held, a delicate interlude between confrontation and resolution. The hall seemed to inhale, the polished wood reflecting not only their images but the culmination of the trials they had endured. Society, for all its watchfulness, mattered less than the understanding between the two of them, a silent covenant stronger than rumor or threat. Alexander reached for her hand deliberately, intertwining their fingers. There was no ceremony, no theatrical flourish, only recognition, the acknowledgement that alliance, protection, and affection could coexist within the same measured gestures. Her gaze lifted to his, steady and unwavering, reflecting the subtle evolution of their bond from obligation and strategy to trust and unspoken devotion. "Have we not," she whispered, "survived every expectation? Every scheme?" "We have," he said, his voice resonant with conviction. "And now there is nothing to withstand but ourselves." Their eyes met across the polished floor, and in that glance was the quiet understanding that society's judgment no longer dictated the terms of their union. What remained was choice, courage, and the mutual recognition of the value each held for the other. The hand resting in hers was a testament to shared endurance, and the soft click of the doors beyond the hall seemed to mark not the retreat of the world, but the establishment of their private dominion. The estate's windows framed the first rays of sunlight, scattering gold across the polished floors and illuminating the pair in a warmth that was at once natural and symbolic. Alexander's hand tightened slightly around hers, the subtle pressure a declaration without words. Eliza responded with a measured squeeze, acknowledging not command but partnership. "I had thought revenge would define this marriage," Alexander said quietly. "Yet I find it has defined neither of us entirely." Eliza's lips curved faintly. "And yet it brought us here," she said. "To clarity if nothing else." He inclined his head, considering her words. "Clarity is merely the beginning. Now we decide what comes after." A faint shiver ran through the room as a sudden breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of early roses and distant rain. It was as though nature itself marked the transition from uncertainty to purpose, from past grievances to deliberate choice. Alexander drew her closer and she did not resist. Their foreheads touched lightly, a gesture of intimacy tempered by restraint, echoing the balance they had cultivated over months of shared challenge. "Whatever comes," he said, voice low, "we face it together." "Yes," she whispered. "Together." Outside, the gardens shimmered with frost melting into dew, the first blossoms of spring nodding in quiet approval. The estate, grand and imposing as ever, seemed smaller somehow, made intimate by the truth they had carved within its walls. The ghosts of past humiliation and anticipated scandal no longer held dominion. What remained was trust, choice, and the fragile yet undeniable tether of mutual regard. And as the doors of the hall swung open to the morning light, the couple stepped forward, hands joined, faces lifted, ready to meet the world not as adversaries of circumstance, nor pawns of society, but as partners forged in challenge and tempered by understanding. The air carried the faintest scent of rose and rain, a subtle reminder that even the harshest winters give way to spring, and that even marriages begun in vengeance may find their own extraordinary path toward devotion. Yet, as they crossed the hall, a distant figure paused beyond the terrace gates, eyes fixed upon the estate. The subtle shift of shadow beneath the morning sun hinted that, while the battle of reputation had been resolved, the currents of society, ambition, and human desire remained unpredictable. And in that silent watchfulness, Alexander and Eliza understood that the trials ahead, though tempered by trust and courage, were only beginning. Their joined hands were the anchor, their mutual resolve the shield, and the horizon, painted in the soft gold of a rising sun, held both promise and the quiet thrill of uncertainty, a world not conquered but claimed together.